Welcome to my channel, where the scariest stories come to life. Before we dive into today's chilling tale, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications, so you never miss a story. Now, let's get into the horror. I live in the southern parts of India, where I go visit my grandmother's house every year during the winter and Christmas time. I was 12 years old at the time and was very excited to go there. Once I arrived and spent a few days there, my three cousins planned an overnight camping trip in the woods near my house. We had gone camping in the same place before with our parents. It was fun, so I was excited to do it again. In the afternoon, we left carrying tents, sleeping bags, torches, and other necessities we would need. We went deep into the woods and decided on a place to set up our tent. After we set up our tent, we decided to go to a famous waterfall in the area that people often visit. I had brought my dog at the time, a 2-year-old German Shepherd, and my three cousins were 15, 14, and 17 years old. I was the youngest. We left to see the waterfall and followed a well-marked trail in the mountainy woods. We reached the waterfall and spent some time there, sitting on a vast tree log, playing Uno to keep us entertained. Before we knew it, it was getting dark, and we decided to go back to our tent to sleep. It was a 5-person tent, big enough for all of us, including my dog. By the time we returned to our tent, it was already dark. We turned on our flashlights and headed back on the trail. Soon after we started from the waterfall, the path split into 2 tracks. We had been there multiple times and didn't ever remember seeing 2 paths, but we picked one and continued walking. 5 minutes later, my dog started acting scared and whining. Soon after that, the woods went utterly silent, almost instantaneously. This creeped all of us out. I felt like I was being watched and sensed an insane dread enveloping me. We kept walking back, slightly faster. As we walked, I swore I started hearing a whistling sound behind me every so often. At one point, all of us stopped and looked, but the whistle sounded very faint and far away. It creeped me out, but I didn't think much of it. A minute later, I heard the same whistle again, but this time it sounded a lot closer and louder. When I looked back, we saw a pair of glowing yellow eyes. We pointed our flashlights at it, and it seemed to disappear as soon as the light hit it. At this point, my dog started sprinting, and so did we. It felt like I ran for hours before we finally saw our tent and quickly got inside. We were all terrified and had no idea what we had just encountered. We tried not to make a noise and attempted to sleep. I was terrified and still felt like I was being watched. I couldn't fall asleep at all. I remembered that the tent was old and had a couple of small holes here and there. What seemed like an hour later, I heard footsteps outside the tent, sending shivers down my spine. The footsteps circled our tent. After making a full circle, I noticed they stopped, and I decided to peer out through one of the small holes in the tent. What I saw still gives me nightmares. It was very tall, some sort of creature with long arms. I assumed it was at least 7 feet tall. It had antlers, huge claws covered in a red liquid I presumed to be blood, sharp teeth, and glowing yellow eyes. It stood on 2 legs like a human. I froze and could barely breathe. I watched it stand there for what felt like hours before it bent and ran away back into the woods on all 4s. As soon as the sunlight became visible and I knew it was daytime, my cousins and I quickly packed up our stuff and got out of there, terrified. I have never told anyone this story except my grandmother. The scarier part is that 3 months later, a group of 3 people were declared missing in that same forest. Only one of their corpses was ever found. It was the fall of 1986. I was 23 years old and had never been scared in the woods before. I always felt like the wilderness was my safe place, somewhere I could relax and escape the stress of life. I've never seen a Bigfoot, skinwalker, or boogeyman, or anything like that, in the woods. As a lineman for a small town in western Kentucky, I'd seen a bunch of crazy things, but nothing supernatural. My only real hobbies were hunting and fishing. Back then, it was easy to find a place to hunt or fish by simply asking the landowner for permission. Most were eager to have the deer population thinned out since they destroyed soybean crops. This was also coal country, and many strip mines from the 1950s left the land unusable for farming or building, so much of it was open for hunting. It was October 1986. The time hadn't changed yet for daylight savings, and it stayed light until just after 7 p.m. I left work at 4, ran home to change into my camo, and headed out. It was bow season in Kentucky, my favorite season. I planned to hunt in an area special to me, Coon Ridge. This was a very remote spot with broken farmland and woods, about a mile from the nearest house. It wasn't easy to get to, but it held sentimental value. My grandmother grew up in an old log cabin in the area, and the remnants of that cabin still stood. I decided to walk the 3/4 of a mile to my hunting spot rather than unload my three-wheeler. I carried my summit climbing stand, bow, knife, and flashlight. After crossing a shin-deep creek and following a farmer's lane along the edge of a cornfield, I reached the highest point of the field and entered the woods. The area was overgrown with blackberry and sabrier thickets, but I found a game trail that opened up onto a hillside with large trees. I climbed about 20 feet up a suitable tree and settled in my stand by 5:30. The woods were alive with activity. Birds, foxes, and squirrels created a symphony of noise. Around 6:30, the gray squirrels came out in full force. By 7, I was ready to climb down. As I started my descent, I heard something walking in the thicket. It sounded like a deer, but I couldn't see it. By 8, under the light of a nearly full moon, I began my climb down. As I descended, I startled a deer, which bolted noisily through the woods. On the ground, I secured my stand and bow, then turned on my flashlight to find the trail. Navigating through the thicket in the dark was disorienting. Eventually, I emerged into the field about 25 yards from where I'd entered. Picking thorns from my hands and legs, I looked around the field. That's when I saw it. Standing in the trail I'd walked earlier was a shape, 6 feet wide and 6 feet tall. It was blocking my only way out. Hoping it was just a strange shadow, I walked toward it. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a shadow, it was 2 people standing side by side. They were a man and a young woman, maybe 20 years old. They stood there silently, not moving. It was 40 degrees and pitch dark, no one should have been there. I walked closer, gripping an arrow from my quiver. At 10 yards away, I spoke, "Kind of cold tonight, isn't it?" They didn't respond or even move. I walked past them, keeping an eye on them the whole time. They never turned, never followed, and never made a sound. By the time I reached my truck, the uneasiness grew. The quiet was oppressive, and I felt like someone might ambush me. After cautiously approaching my vehicle, I inspected it. Everything seemed fine, so I got in and drove away. The next day at work, I noticed all 4 tires on my truck were low. Upon inspection, I found 10 to 15 roofing nails in each one. Someone had sabotaged my vehicle. I never hunted that area alone again. To this day, I don't know who those 2 people were or how they got there. There were never signs of drugs or anything suspicious in the area. But after that night, the woods at Coon Ridge always felt different, like someone was watching me. The stories I want to share mostly take place in the deep woods and probably involve cryptids of some sort. Maybe it's because most of my home country's landmass is covered in forest, and if that's not enough, a third of the nation is made up of swamps and different water bodies. There's plenty of land, seldom trodden. Ancient deities and mystical creatures still hold their place in the sacred groves, amongst glacial erratics, and in our folklore. Forests have always been a source of life, security, and protection for our people, and we highly respect them. Even the city slickers feel at home in the woods and look for strength from them. If you visit any city in my country, you'll see many parks and woods even in urban environments, and you might even get fresh air poisoning at the airport. Our forests also hide plenty of other things. One of these things is forest gravesites. We have plenty of scary things here: brown bears, wolves, bobcats, moose, and other critters that could definitely destroy you. Yet, the most challenging thing I've ever seen was either the time I saw a moose, its back end, at least, disappearing into the spruce trees 10 meters away from me, or when my dad decided to follow me on a bike while I was tending to my duties and scared me just to get a funny picture. Too bad he aimed the camera too low, so my near-death experience face after getting startled with a loud snarl wasn't immortalized. I don't know if this story is particularly scary, but it was definitely strange. I've been working as a caretaker for one of these gravesites since I was a preteen. The site itself is simple: a single tall concrete headstone with almost completely faded text and a small decoration added some years ago. A small patch of grass stretches out from both sides of the stone. I would clean the site, plant new flowers, and maintain the area during the summer so tourists could visit it. Over the years, I've noticed that the atmosphere there can be very different. Usually, it's quiet and calm. You can see a long distance between the tall pines. It's quiet because the nearby birds have been startled into momentary silence. But a few times, I felt quite heavy when visiting this area, like there was a burden on my shoulders. You ever get that feeling like somebody's watching you and you just can't see them, but you know somebody's there? It felt like that, like somebody was watching me from the trees, forcing the animals to remain silent. That typically calming sight of tall pines and good visibility felt uncomfortable because I couldn't see what was causing the heavy feeling. Now these graves are a remnant of our Independence War, belonging to soldiers from the invading country. There's plenty of speculation about how they came to rest there, but the first victim of war is always the truth, so I won't speculate. I just know these men were denied their resting place in their homeland or on holy ground, and their families lack closure. Maybe that's why there's sometimes such an uncomfortable feeling there. When I leave the area, the sense of relief is palpable, like a large boulder falling from my shoulders. I feel much lighter afterward. I often feel sorry for those young men who died so far from home, never to see it again, even if they were an invading army. Like I said, it's not the scariest event, but it is unsettling and strange in its simplicity. Back in the late 1980s, when I was in my mid-20s, I was an avid camper and hiker. Growing up in Rhode Island, I quickly exhausted the local campgrounds and started seeking something more adventurous. The Appalachian Trail kept coming up in conversations, especially with my uncle, who had hiked its entirety back in the 1950s. His stories painted the trail as a magical escape into true wilderness. In the summer of 1989, I decided to embark on my own journey. I couldn't take the time to hike the entire trail, so I settled on trekking the southern portion, from Harper's Ferry to Asheville, North Carolina. I made my way to Harper's Ferry by bus and train, gathered my supplies, and set out on what I thought would be an unforgettable adventure. The first few days were grueling, but I soon found my rhythm. At night, I slept in a hammock to keep away the bugs and other creepy crawlies. Though it wasn't the most comfortable arrangement, it did the job. Each night, I was kept awake by the sounds of nocturnal animals, but I embraced it as part of the experience, until one night changed everything. I woke up to the sound of rustling leaves and turned to see a dark, human-shaped figure standing still, just a few feet away from me. My blood ran cold. Without thinking, I rolled out of my hammock and bolted into the woods. After catching my breath, I circled back cautiously to retrieve my gear, but the figure was gone, and nothing had been touched. Though I left the area as quickly as possible, the incident haunted me. I began setting up makeshift tripwires with fishing line and cans to alert me of any intruders at night. While I had a false alarm with a curious fox, the sense of unease remained. A week later, I had put significant distance between myself and that nightmarish encounter. I had started to feel safe again, but that night, I woke up to find myself trapped. The fabric of my hammock was wrapped tightly around me, cocooning me completely. Before I could process what was happening, I felt myself being dragged along the forest floor. Panic set in. I screamed and struggled, but couldn't free myself. Desperate, I remembered my old wristwatch, which had a sharp, jagged clasp. Managing to maneuver it into my hand, I used it to cut through the fabric. After what felt like an eternity, I tore through the material and escaped, sprinting blindly into the night. Eventually, I reached a house and banged on the door, begging for help. The family inside let me in, and I called the local sheriff. The next morning, we retraced my steps but found no evidence of the attack, no hammock, no tracks, nothing. The sheriff dismissed my story as a figment of my imagination, brought on by exhaustion. But I knew what had happened. The fear I felt was too real to ignore. I cut my trip short and returned home, shaken but grateful to be alive. When I finally told my uncle about the ordeal, he wasn't surprised. He revealed that during his time on the trail, he had also encountered unsettling people, individuals who lived beyond the bounds of society. To this day, I haven't returned to the Appalachian Trail. Maybe one day I will, but I'll be better prepared. The trail will always be there, but so might whoever, or whatever, was out there that night. Thanks for sticking around till the end. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to give the video a like and leave a comment with your thoughts. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a terrifying tale. See you in the next one.